The silence in the small apartment was a physical weight. Clara Jensen stood in the middle of the living room, a single piece of paper trembling in her hand. It was the final eviction notice. The cheap paper felt rough against her skin, the black ink a stark, unforgiving sentence. Outside, the city hummed with life. But in here, the only sounds were the shallow, rhythmic breathing of her two children sleeping in the next room and the frantic, painful thudding of her own heart. A cold draft snaked across the bare wooden floor, and she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the chill of pure, undiluted fear. Her stomach was a tight, aching knot of hunger and dread. The air tasted stale, thick with the ghost of the cheap canned soup they'd had for dinner. Grief for her husband was a constant, dull ache, but this new terror was a sharp, piercing blade. 1 week. 7 days until the lock would be changed, until she, Leo, and Sophia would be standing on the curb with nothing but what they could carry. Her gaze fell upon the small, scarred kitchen table where her life had been reduced to 2 neat piles. On one side, a mountain of crisp and white envelopes, the medical bills that had devoured their savings, their future, and finally, her husband's life. On the other, a small stack of worn bills. She had counted it 3 times. $900. The number mocked her. It was the last remnant of their life together, the final buffer against the abyss. Her sewing machine, a heavy black antique that had been her livelihood, sat silent in the corner, shrouded in a thin layer of dust. Her hands, usually so steady and precise, now shook too much to thread a needle. She felt the phantom pains of hunger, a hollow emptiness she had been ignoring for days, ensuring every last bite of food went to Leo and Sophia. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. The metallic taste of panic filled her mouth. $900 to erase an avalanche of debt and find a new world for her children. Clara pushed the door to the children's room open, the hinges letting out a soft, mournful creak. The moonlight cut a silver sliver across the floor, illuminating her son, Leo, who was 10. Even in sleep, his brow was furrowed, as if he carried the weight of their troubles in his dreams. He had tried so hard to be brave, to be the man of the house, but she saw the fear in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Beside him, 7-year-old Sophia was curled into a tight ball, her small hand clutching the frayed ear of a stuffed rabbit. A fresh wave of nausea rose in Clara's throat. How could she explain this to them? How could she look into their innocent faces and tell them their home, the only home they had ever known, was being taken away? The shame was a physical thing, a hot, burning coal in her chest. Her husband had made her promise to keep them safe. Now, the echo of that promise was a cruel accusation. She felt like a complete and utter failure, a captain sinking with the most precious cargo in the world. She retreated from the doorway, the darkness of the living room swallowing her whole. The ticking of the clock on the wall was unnaturally loud, each second a hammer blow counting down the 7 days she had left. 168 hours. It sounded like an eternity and no time at all. She let her fingers trail across the worn floral fabric of the armchair where her husband, David, used to sit, reading stories to the children. The fabric was cool and empty. The whole apartment felt like a museum of a life that was already over, each object a ghost whispering of laughter and security that no longer existed. A single crayon drawing by Sophia was taped to the refrigerator, a lopsided sun smiling over a crooked house. Clara felt her throat tighten, a sob building behind her ribs with so much pressure she thought she might break. Her lungs felt tight, the air too thick to breathe. She was drowning in the silence, in the memories, in the crushing weight of what was coming. This wasn't just losing an apartment. It was the erasure of their entire past. Standing at the grimy window, Clara watched the distant, indifferent headlights of cars painting fleeting streaks of light on the ceiling. She felt profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Her world had shrunk to this tiny, doomed apartment and the 2 small heartbeats in the next room. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, the sensation a small, sharp anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. If she closed her eyes, the image that haunted her sleep appeared instantly. Her children's small, trusting hands in hers, their faces looking up at her with questions she couldn't answer as the rain began to fall on a nameless city street. It was a premonition that made her stomach clench. With a final, desperate act, She pulled out the worn leather wallet. The $900 felt like a handful of paper leaves against a hurricane. It was everything, and it was nothing. Her story, their story, was on the brink of ending in the cold, harsh reality of the streets. If you can feel the chill of Clara's despair, and believe that even in the darkest night a flicker of hope must survive, subscribe and follow her journey, because the end of her world is only the beginning of her story. In the suffocating silence of the hours before dawn, Clara's world had shrunk to the cold, blue light of her cracked phone screen. Her thumb moved mechanically, a desperate, repetitive scroll through a digital graveyard of hopes. Apartments for rent, rooms to let, each one a fresh stab of impossibility. $2,000 a month, $3,000. The numbers swam before her tired eyes, mocking the paltry sum in her account. Her heart, a weary drum, beat a rhythm of pure dread. Then she saw it, an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of her despair, an ad for an unconverted attic in a historic downtown building. The price was so low it felt like a typo, a cruel joke. Yet, it was the only number less than 900, a tiny, treacherous spark of hope ignited in the cold emptiness of her chest. She read the sparse description again and again, the words blurring. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen, the faint glow illuminating the exhaustion etched onto her face. Was this a lifeline or a new kind of trap? The decision was not a decision at all. It was an act of surrender. What other choice did she have? The abyss of the streets yawned before her, cold and indifferent. This attic, this suspicious, impossibly cheap space, was the only plank left to cling to. Clara felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird of terror and desperate hope. She imagined telling the children, forcing a bright, confident tone she was nowhere near feeling. We have a new home, an adventure. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely dial, she called the number. The voice on the other end was clipped, impersonal, and uninterested in her questions. The transaction was swift, a digital transfer that drained her bank account to zero. The number 900 vanished, replaced by a digital receipt and a key code. The finality of the act stole her breath. She had just bet their entire world on a ghost of a chance, a whisper in the digital dark. The last day in their apartment was a funeral for a life. Every object they packed was a memory, a small ghost of happiness. Clara moved with a numb, robotic efficiency, folding clothes, wrapping the few chipped plates in newspaper. The sound of packing tape being ripped from the roll was a harsh, tearing sound that echoed the feeling in her chest. Leo, stoic and silent, helped her lift the small, worn suitcases, his young face set in a grim line. Sophia clutched her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide and confused as their world was methodically dismantled and put into cardboard boxes. The final click of the lock as Clara shut the door behind them for the last time was a sound of absolute severance. It was the closing of a book, the end of a chapter. As they stood in the empty hallway, the sterile silence of the apartment they had called home pressed in on them. Clara felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, forcing a brittle smile for her children. The adventure, she had called it. Now the lie felt heavy and suffocating. The bus ride across town was a journey through a world that no longer felt like it belonged to them. Clara stared out at the blur of familiar streets and shops, now just a backdrop to their private tragedy. The city's vibrant pulse, the honking cars, the crowds on the sidewalks, it all seemed distant, part of a different reality. She held Leo's and Sophia's hands tightly, their small fingers a fragile anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. Her own hand was clammy, her palms slick with a cold sweat. The bus rumbled and groaned, its engine a monotonous drone that matched the dull ache in her head. With every stop, with every mile that separated them from their old life, the weight of her gamble grew heavier. She had thrown their last dice. Now, they were hurtling toward the result, and the knot of fear in her stomach tightened until she could barely breathe. The children were quiet, their faces pressed against the cool, grimy glass of the window, watching their past recede. They disembarked onto a cobblestone street in a part of downtown that time had forgotten. The building loomed over them, a skeleton of faded grandeur. Its stone facade was stained with decades of grime, and gargoyles with chipped, snarling faces peered down from the eaves, their empty eyes seeming to judge the newcomers. The address from the ad was carved above a colossal oak door, its wood dark and weathered, bound with tarnished iron straps. It looked less like an entrance to apartments and more like a gateway to a mausoleum. The air here was heavy and still, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the nearby river and the dry scent of ancient dust. A profound sense of neglect hung over the place, a palpable aura of decay. Clara's fleeting hope, which had flickered so weakly during the bus ride, was now being choked by a rising tide of dread. This grand, decaying structure felt like a warning, its silent, imposing presence a testament to forgotten things. There was no elevator. The key code opened the heavy main door into a cavernous, dimly lit lobby that smelled of stone and abandonment. A grand staircase, its wooden banister thick with dust, spiraled upwards into the gloom. Their journey had only just begun. Clara hoisted one of the heavier bags, her muscles screaming in protest, and began to climb, flight after flight of narrow, creaking stairs. With each floor they passed, the air grew staler, the light dimmer. Their footsteps were the only sound, echoing unnervingly in the vast, empty space. Leo struggled behind her with his own small backpack, his breathing becoming labored. Sophia whimpered, and Clara had to stop, her own lungs burning, to lift her into her arms. The climb was a grueling, vertical pilgrimage into darkness. It felt symbolic, a physical manifestation of their descent. Each step upwards was a step deeper into the unknown, further away from the sunlit world and closer to the forgotten space at the very top. Finally, they reached the top landing, a small, cramped space under the angled eaves of the roof. There was only one door. It was small, unmarked, and looked as if it hadn't been opened in a century. The once white paint was a cracked and peeling landscape of beige and gray, the wood beneath it warped and dark. The doorknob was tarnished brass, cold and greasy to the touch. This was it, the door to their new life. Clara felt a wave of nausea so intense she had to lean against the wall to steady herself. Her heart pounded a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. This was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The silence, the smell, the crushing sense of isolation. She looked down at Sophia's trusting face, asleep on her shoulder, and at Leo's wide, expectant eyes. For them, she had to see this through. Taking a shaky breath that did little to calm her, she inserted the old-fashioned skeleton key into the lock. It turned with a dry, grinding screech of protest. The door swung inward with a low, mournful groan, releasing a blast of air so foul it made Clara gag. It was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating wave of smells that spoke of years of neglect. The dominant scent was mold, a deep, earthy, cellar-like stench, mingled with the sharp, sour aroma of decay and the stagnant odor of standing water. It was the smell of something long dead and left to rot. Her stomach churned violently, and she instinctively pulled her children back, shielding them from the initial onslaught. Peering into the gloom, her eyes struggled to adjust. The light from the hallway seemed to be swallowed by the darkness within, revealing not a home, but a wound, a forgotten, derelict space that was actively decomposing. In that single, overwhelming moment, the last fragile embers of hope were extinguished, replaced by a cold, heavy certainty. She had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb. Clara took a hesitant step inside, and her boot made a soft, sickening squelch. She looked down and saw that the floorboards in the entryway were dark with moisture, warped and soft to the touch. Her gaze followed the trail of dampness to the center of the vast, sloping room. There, an orchestra of decay was in full performance. A collection of mismatched buckets, rusty paint cans, and even a cracked ceramic bowl were arranged in a desperate attempt to catch a slow, steady drip of water from the ceiling. A dark, ugly stain spread out from a gash in the roof above, a wound that bled rainwater into their new home. The sound, a constant and rhythmic plink, plonk, drip, was instantly maddening. It was the sound of failure, a relentless audio cue marking the seconds of their new too wretched existence. The air was thick and humid, clinging to her skin and clothes like a damp, cold shroud. This wasn't a place to live. It was a place to watch things fall apart. Her eyes, slowly adjusting to the oppressive gloom, began to take in the full horror of the walls. What might have once been elegant, floral wallpaper was now a grotesque tapestry of decay. It was peeling away from the plaster in long, curling strips, like sunburnt skin. In vast patches, it was bubbled and blistered from the damp, and dark, fuzzy blooms of black and green mold crawled across the surface in cancerous patterns. Where the paper had surrendered completely, it revealed crumbling lath and plaster, the building's very bones exposed and rotting. But it was the wiring that made a genuine chill of fear run down her spine. Tangled, chaotic nests of ancient, cloth-insulated wires drooped from the rafters and snaked along the baseboards like dead black vines. The insulation was frayed in multiple places, exposing the dull copper within. The thought of plugging in any appliance, let alone her precious sewing machine, sent a jolt of terror through her. This attic wasn't just squalid. It was a fire waiting to happen. On the far wall, angled beneath the steep pitch of the roof, was a single, arched window. It should have been a source of light, of hope, a connection to the outside world. Instead, it was another monument to neglect. It was large, a relic of the building's more glorious past, but it was so thoroughly caked in a thick, semi-opaque layer of grime that it barely allowed any light to pass through. The daylight that did manage to penetrate the filth was transformed into a depressing, gray, underwater murk that filled the attic with a gloomy twilight. Clara walked over to it, the floorboards groaning under her weight, and scraped a small clear patch with her fingernail. The view was a final, crushing disappointment. All she could see was a solid brick wall, the side of the adjacent building, so close she felt she could almost reach out and touch it. It was a view of nothing, a dead end. The window offered no escape, only a confirmation that they were utterly and completely boxed in. She turned from the window of despair to face a sight that was infinitely worse. Her children's faces. Sophia had finally peeked out from the safety of her mother's coat, and her small face crumpled as her eyes took in the dripping ceiling and peeling walls. A small heartbroken whimper escaped her lips, but it was Leo's reaction that shattered what was left of Clara's composure. He stood just inside the doorway, his small suitcase dropped at his feet, his body rigid with shock. His wide eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail of the squalor. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. He just looked at Clara, his expression a devastating mixture of disbelief and disillusionment. All the forced bravery, the pretense of being the little man of the house, had vanished. In his eyes, she saw the death of a child's trust in a parent. That silent, lost look was a judgment more piercing than any angry words. She had promised them safety, and she had led them here, to this ruin. Her gaze, desperate to look anywhere but at her son, was finally captured by the room's most unsettling and dominant feature. It was a mirror, but it was more than a mirror. It was a presence. It consumed the entire far wall, stretching from the damp floor to the sloping ceiling. Its frame was obscenely ornate, a riot of carved scrolls and figures. But whatever gold or silver had once adorned it was now hidden beneath a thick, black tarnish that looked like soot. The intricate details were clogged with a century of dust and grime. The glass itself was strangely dark, almost black, and it reflected the grim attic not with clarity, but with a murky, distorted depth that made the space feel both endless and suffocating. It didn't just reflect the room, it seemed to absorb the light and the hope, giving nothing back but a darker version of their own misery. It felt ancient, malevolent, and watchful, a silent, dead eye in the heart of their new prison. The full, crushing weight of her failure descended upon Clara like a physical blow. She had taken their last $900, the final shield against the world, and thrown it into this black hole. There was no one to call, no place to go back to. The eviction notice that had driven them here and the dripping reality of this attic fused into a single, seamless nightmare. A dry, ragged sob tore from her throat, a sound of pure agony. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the damp, filthy floorboards, oblivious to the cold seeping through her jeans. The rhythmic plink, plonk of the water dripping into the buckets was the only sound, a steady, torturous metronome counting out her despair. Silent tears, hot with shame and grief, streamed down her face as she looked at the peeling walls, the exposed wires, the ruin she had purchased. She had tried to save her family, and in doing so, had led them into a trap far worse than the one they had fled. This was it, the absolute bottom. a place lower and colder than she had ever imagined. The despair she felt now was a different, more venomous kind than the fear of homelessness. It was the despair born from the corpse of hope. It was the agony of seeing a lifeline turn into a noose. Here, in this forgotten attic, surrounded by the overwhelming evidence of her catastrophic judgment, Clara felt something vital inside her snap, the last vestiges of her strength, the stubborn will to fight that had carried her through her husband's illness and their mounting debts, simply evaporated into the mold-scented air. She wrapped her arms around her own trembling body, a profound coldness settling deep into her bones. Leo finally moved, walking over to sit beside her on the dirty floor, placing a small, hesitant hand on her arm. But Clara could barely feel it. She stared blankly at the dark, imposing mirror, which reflected their huddled, pathetic forms back at them, and felt nothing but the vast, empty chasm of utter defeat. The days that followed were a blur of grim, determined labor. The attic's oppressive despair had not vanished, but Clara refused to let it paralyze her. She channeled her grief and shame into a fury of cleaning. There was a war to be waged against the filth, and it was a war she could fight with bleach and a scrubbing brush. She started with the floor, scouring the damp, sticky boards until her knuckles were raw and the muscles in her back screamed in protest. The rhythmic scrape of the brush against the wood was a sound of defiance. With every inch of grime she removed, she felt a tiny, fractional piece of her own agency return. The air began to lose its thick, suffocating quality, slowly replaced by the sharp, chemical smell of her cleaning supplies. It was a sterile, artificial scent, but it was the smell of progress. It was the smell of a fight. She was no longer just a victim of this space. She was at war with it, reclaiming it one painful, exhausting inch at a time for her children. Leo and Sophia watched her, their small faces a mixture of confusion and cautious curiosity. Sophia, who had been inconsolable, was drawn into the activity. Clara gave her a damp rag and tasked her with wiping down the baseboards, a simple job that made her feel important, a part of the solution. The little girl attacked the task with a solemn focus, her small tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. Leo, however, remained distant. He did his part when asked, hauling the disgusting buckets of dirty water to the communal bathroom at the end of the hall and refilling them, but his movements were mechanical. His eyes, dark and too old for his age, were constantly fixed on the single, grime-caked window, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. He had seen the depths of his mother's despair, and the memory of it had erected a wall between them. Clara felt his silent judgment, a cold weight that sat beside the constant ache of her muscles, and knew this battle was for his soul as much as their survival. Clara focused her energy on creating a small island of habitability in the vast sea of squalor. She dragged their mattresses to the driest corner of the attic, far from the rhythmic torture of the dripping ceiling. She used their cleanest sheets to wall off a small sleeping area, a makeshift tent that gave the illusion of privacy and safety. It was a pathetic fortress, but it was theirs. As she worked, her mind was a maelstrom of frantic calculation. The frayed wiring meant no stove, no hot plate, not even her sewing machine. Meals were cold sandwiches and fruit bought from a corner store, each purchase a tiny drain on a non-existent budget. Her stomach was a constant, hollow ache, but she watched her children eat with a fierce, protective focus. Every bite they took was a small victory against the ruin that surrounded them. The physical exhaustion was a blessing. It was so profound, so absolute, that when she finally collapsed onto her mattress at night, she fell into a dreamless sleep, too tired for the nightmares to find her. The colossal tarnished mirror on the far wall remained untouched. It was too big, too imposing, too unsettling to even consider cleaning. It loomed over their small, pathetic camp like a malevolent god, its dark surface absorbing the weak light and giving back a distorted, gloomy image of their struggle. Clara actively avoided looking at it. The sight of their huddled forms reflected in its depths a confirmation of their pathetic state. She felt its presence constantly, a cold spot in the room, a silent observer to their misery. The children seemed to feel it too. Sophia gave it a wide berth, and Clara once saw her whisper to her stuffed rabbit, pointing at the mirror and shaking her head. Leo, on the other hand, seemed drawn to it. He would sit near it for long stretches, staring not at his own reflection, but into the dark, murky glass, as if he were trying to see something hidden in its depths. The mirror felt less like an object and more like a locked door, and a part of Clara was terrified of what might be on the other side. The change came on the third day. Clara, having exhausted every other cleaning task she could safely manage, finally decided she had to face the mirror. The grime on its surface was just another layer of filth to be conquered. She filled a bucket with soapy water, her jaw set with determination. As she began to scrub at the lower corner of the glass, Leo, who had been sitting quietly nearby, suddenly spoke. His voice was a small, hesitant whisper. "Mom," he said, his eyes wide and fixed on a spot just above her head. It moved. Clara paused, her arm aching. She looked at her own tired reflection, at the strands of hair stuck to her sweaty forehead. "What moved, sweetie?" "It's just us." He shook his head, his finger trembling as he pointed. "No, not us. Behind us, in the glass, I saw a flicker. A chill, completely unrelated to the damp air, traced a cold path down her spine. Her stomach clenched. She told herself it was a trick of the light, a shadow, her son's overactive imagination in this creepy, unsettling place. She tried to laugh it off, to soothe him with a gentle touch on his shoulder. "Leo, honey, there's nothing there. The glass is just old and dirty. It makes things look funny." But her voice lacked conviction. He was insistent, his eyes filled with a certainty that unnerved her. "No, Mom. I saw it. It was like someone walked past a light, really fast." His words hung in the still, heavy air. The rhythmic plink, plonk from the dripping buckets suddenly sounded unnaturally loud, like a sinister clock counting down to something. She slowly stood up, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She stared into the dark glass, trying to see what he had seen. All it gave back was their own distorted reflections. Two small, frightened figures in a vast, decaying room. But now, the darkness in the mirror no longer seemed empty. It felt watchful. It felt deep. It felt like it was hiding something just beyond the veil of their own world. To placate him, or perhaps to reassure herself, Clara pressed her palm flat against the surface of the mirror. The shock was immediate and profound. The glass was cold, not just cool to the touch like a normal pane of glass on a mild day, but unnaturally, deeply cold like a block of ice. The coldness seemed to leach the warmth directly from her skin, a sensation so jarring it made her snatch her hand back as if she'd been burned. She felt the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. A wave of nausea, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. This was wrong. A mirror inside a room, away from any outside walls, should be room temperature. This cold was the cold of a cellar, of a deep, sunless place. Her gaze shifted from the glass to the ornate, tarnished frame. She ran her fingers along the edge where it met the wall, and her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't perfectly flush. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible gap. The frame wasn't just bolted to the wall, it was set into it. The pieces clicked into place in her mind with a terrifying, sickening clarity. The faintness of their reflections that Leo had noticed, the flicker of movement he had seen, the profound, unnatural cold. The way the frame was set into the wall. A memory from an old spy movie surfaced in her mind, a scene she hadn't thought of in years. It wasn't a mirror. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, choked sound. She pressed her face close to the glass, cupping her hands around her eyes to block out what little light there was in the attic. She peered into the inky blackness, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A faint, geometric pattern. The shadowy outline of what looked like a small desk and a chair. It was a one-way mirror. The cold dread that filled her was absolute. They were not looking at a reflection. They were looking into a hidden, sealed room. And for 3 days, something in that room could have been looking back at them. The terror was a physical thing, a jolt of ice water through her veins. Her first instinct was to grab her children and run, to flee this place and never look back. But where would they go? The street was their only alternative. The thought of their faces, cold and hungry on a rainy curb, was a more potent fear than any hidden room. The adrenaline that had surged through her began to curdle, replaced by a different, more dangerous emotion, desperate curiosity. 1,000 questions screamed in her mind. Who built this? Why? What was inside? The existence of this secret room shifted the entire narrative of their misfortune. This attic wasn't just a derelict space. It was a place with a secret someone had gone to enormous lengths to conceal. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she realized the true meaning of the one-way glass. It wasn't just for looking in, it was for ensuring that whatever was inside could never, ever be seen from the outside. Her fear was still present, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was overshadowed by a burning, obsessive need to know more. This secret felt connected to them now, intertwined with their fate. The low price of the attic suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. Perhaps the seller knew about this, wanted to be rid of it, passing the curse on to some desperate soul who wouldn't ask questions. Clara's gaze moved from the mirror to the wall beside it. If there was a hidden room, there had to be a hidden door. The wallpaper was a peeling, bubbled mess, but her eyes, now sharpened by suspicion, searched for any inconsistency. She ran her fingers over the surface, feeling the crumbling plaster, the damp patches, the raised blisters. The wall felt solid, unyielding. She moved methodically, her touch light, her senses on high alert. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing and the steady, maddening drip from the ceiling, a sound that now seemed to be mocking her frantic search. Then she found it. Not a bump, not a crack, but a line. A perfectly straight, vertical line, running from the floor to the ceiling, so faint it was almost invisible beneath the faded floral pattern of the wallpaper. Her fingers traced it, feeling a subtle, almost non-existent seam. Her heart hammered. She followed it. The line ran up, then made a perfect 90-degree turn, running horizontally for about 3 feet before turning down again, back to the floor. It was the unmistakable outline of a door, cleverly hidden in the chaos of the peeling paper. It was right next to the mirror, a secret entrance hiding in plain sight. She pressed against it, expecting it to give, but it was solid, unmoving. There was no knob, no handle, no visible hinges. It was sealed. A cold wave of frustration washed over her. To be so close. To have the answer to the mystery right in front of her, just a layer of plaster and wood away, was a new kind of torture. The memory of her meager possessions flashed in her mind. Tucked away in one of the cardboard boxes was a small, red metal toolbox her husband had kept, filled with a random assortment of hammers, screwdrivers, and wrenches. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through her frustration. She scrambled to the box, her hands tearing at the packing tape. She ripped it open, tossing aside clothes and kitchen utensils until her fingers closed around the cold, heavy steel of a crowbar. It was small, more of a pry bar, but it felt like a weapon, a key, a scepter of power. The weight of it in her hand was a solid, reassuring thing. It was a tool for taking things apart, for revealing what was hidden. She carried it back to the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She looked at Leo, who was watching her with wide, fearful eyes. "Stand back," she said, her voice a low, determined command that she didn't recognize as her own. The woman who cried on the floor was gone. This was someone new. She wedged the flattened tip of the crowbar into the faint seam near the floor. She put her shoulder into it, leveraging her entire body weight. At first, nothing happened. The wall resisted, solid and stubborn. Sweat beaded on her forehead, trickling into her eyes. The muscles in her arms and back strained, burning with the effort. A low grunt of frustration escaped her lips. She repositioned the crowbar, trying a different angle, pushing with a desperate, primal force. She was no longer just trying to open a door. She was trying to break through the wall of her own helplessness. She had to get in. She had to know. The secret in that room felt like the only thing that mattered, the only thing that could change the miserable trajectory of their lives. For a moment, she feared the wall would win, that the secret would remain locked away forever, mocking her from just beyond her reach. Then, a sound, a sharp, cracking noise, like a bone breaking. It was followed by the gratifying splinter of dry wood. A small section of the plaster and wallpaper around the crowbar crumbled away, revealing the dark, solid wood of the doorframe beneath. A surge of adrenaline shot through her. It was real. It was there. She worked the crowbar deeper into the crack, gritting her teeth with the effort. With another powerful heave, a long, groaning screech echoed through the attic as ancient, hidden hinges protested their first movement in what must have been decades. The seam widened. A thin sliver of absolute, unpolluted darkness appeared. A puff of air, stale and utterly devoid of moisture, escaped the opening, carrying a scent she couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't the smell of mold or decay. It was the dry, clean scent of old paper, leather, and something else. The faint, metallic tang of secrets long buried. With a final, desperate shove, the hidden door swung inward, its hinges screaming in protest. It opened not into blackness, but into a space illuminated by the faint light filtering through the one-way mirror. Clara stood at the threshold, breathing heavily, the crowbar still clutched in her hand. She was looking into a time capsule. The contrast was breathtakingly stark. Outside, in the attic, was a world of dampness, rot, and decay. Inside this small, hidden room, everything was pristine, untouched, and perfectly preserved. The air itself felt different, dry, still, and silent. The walls were lined with what looked like thick, sound-deadening cork tiles, which explained the profound quiet. The space was no bigger than a walk-in closet, a tiny secret world hermetically sealed from the passage of time. Her fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now eclipsed by a profound sense of awe and wonder. She had breached the tomb. She took a hesitant step inside, her boots making no sound on the clean, bare wooden floor. The light from the one-way mirror cast an eerie, silvery glow over the room's sole contents. Against the back wall, directly in the line of sight of the mirror, sat a small, elegant wooden desk. It was completely free of the dust and grime that coated every surface in the attic. The wood, a dark, rich mahogany, still held a faint sheen. A simple wooden chair was tucked neatly beneath it, as if its occupant had just stood up and walked away. The scene was frozen, a perfect tableau of a moment locked away from the world. It felt sacred, forbidden. The silence was absolute, a heavy, sound-proofed blanket that was more profound than the quiet of any church or library. It was the silence of a place designed to keep a secret, to swallow all sound and never let it escape. This was not a room. It was a vault. On the surface of the desk, placed squarely in the center, were two objects. They drew her gaze with an almost physical pull. One was a leather-bound book, its cover a deep, dark brown, so coated in a fine layer of dust that it looked gray. The leather was cracked with age, but it was clearly a high-quality journal or diary. Beside it lay a thick manila folder, bulging with papers. It was tied shut with a faded red string, and the words, "Confidential, Blackwood Property Survey," were faintly visible, stamped in what had once been black ink. A chill went through Clara. Blackwood. She had seen that name on a campaign poster for mayor just a few days ago. The name was synonymous with money and power in this city. A cold, electric feeling shot through her fingers. This wasn't just a random secret. This was a secret that had a name, a powerful, dangerous name. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering over the diary. The air seemed to crackle with a strange energy. She felt like an archaeologist uncovering a king's tomb, a trespasser on holy ground. She blew gently on the cover, and a cloud of fine, gray dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the mirror. The dust smelled ancient, dry, and faintly of leather. She let her fingers trace the embossed title on the cover, now revealed beneath the dust. A. Vance, Geological Field Notes. The name meant nothing to her, but the title sent another jolt through her system. Geological. Survey. The words from the folder and the diary connected in her mind, forming the faint outline of a story she didn't yet understand. This wasn't a personal diary filled with emotional confessions. This was a record. This was evidence. She picked up the diary. It was heavier than she expected, dense with pages. The leather felt brittle under her touch, but the book itself was solid, the binding still strong. She untied the small leather strap that held it closed, and the cover fell open with a soft sigh of ancient paper. The pages were filled with a neat, precise, masculine hand. The ink faded from black to a brownish gray. The writing was dense, filled with technical drawings of rock strata, chemical formulas, and precise coordinates. It was the work of a meticulous, scientific mind. She gently turned a few pages, the dry paper whispering under her fingertips. The smell that rose from the book was intoxicating. The pure, clean scent of old paper and ink, a perfume of history and hidden knowledge. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. This book in her hands, this forgotten record, felt more valuable and more dangerous than any amount of gold or jewels. Her attention then shifted to the thick manila folder. It looked official, important. The faded red string that held it shut seemed like a final, fragile barrier against the secrets within. With fingers that felt clumsy and numb, she carefully untied the knot. The string crumbled slightly as she worked it loose. She lifted the flap of the folder. Inside was not a chaotic jumble of papers, but a neatly organized stack of documents. On top was a geological survey map of the very land the town was built on. Its colors faded, but its lines still clear and precise. Beneath it were property deeds, the paper thick and official, bearing the embossed seals of the city clerk's office from the 1950s, and under those were several signed and notarized affidavits. The signatures at the bottom a collection of names she didn't recognize. The sheer weight of the officialdom of these documents was staggering. Clara lifted the top deed, her eyes scanning the legal language. It documented a land transfer. The paper was thick and slightly yellowed, and it felt heavy in her hand, heavy with the weight of its own history. The scent of the documents was different from the diaries, less personal, more institutional, the dry, dusty smell of bureaucracy and law. It was the smell of power, of signed and sealed decisions that could build fortunes or destroy lives. As her eyes scanned the lines of typed text, a name jumped out at her, the same name from the political posters, the name stamped on the folder itself, Blackwood. The name was there as the grantee, the recipient of a vast tract of land. A cold dread, colder and sharper than any she had felt before, began to snake its way around her heart. She was holding a history book that no one had ever been allowed to read. She carefully spread some of the documents out on the small desk, her hands moving with a reverence she didn't know she possessed. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. These weren't just papers. They were the foundational bones of the town's history, a history that had been deliberately buried in this soundproofed tomb. The geologist's diary, the official surveys, the signed affidavits, the property deeds, they were all pieces of a single, massive puzzle. A puzzle that someone had killed, or at least silenced, to keep hidden. And the name Blackwood was at the very center of it all. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The pittance she had paid for this attic, the suspicious ad, the state of decay, it all started to make a dark, sinister sense. She hadn't bought a home. She had bought a piece of evidence. She had stumbled into a crime scene that was over half a century old. The fear that had been a low hum in her veins now roared to life. But it was a new kind of fear. It wasn't the passive, helpless fear of a victim. It was the sharp, active fear of someone holding a lit stick of dynamite. She looked from the papers back to the one-way mirror, seeing their faint, cheering ghostly reflections staring back from the attic. She saw Leo and Sophia, small and vulnerable, waiting for her just on the other side of the wall. For a moment, she wanted to put it all back, to close the door, seal the wall, and pretend she had never found any of it. It was too big, too dangerous. This was a secret that powerful people had protected for generations. But then she looked at her own reflection. She saw the grime on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, but she also saw a glint of something new. The despair was gone, replaced by a terrifying, steely resolve. This secret was her burden now, but it was also something else. It was power. It was leverage. In this forgotten room, surrounded by the evidence of a colossal, foundational crime, Clara Jensen, the widowed, destitute seamstress, was no longer powerless. She was the single greatest threat to the most powerful family in the city. The dripping ceiling, the eviction notice, the gnawing hunger, it all seemed to belong to a different lifetime. She gently gathered the documents, her touch now proprietary, protective. She held the folder and the diary to her chest, the weight of them a solid, dangerous anchor. The rules of her world had just been irrevocably rewritten. The game had changed, and as she stood in the silence of that hidden room, She realized with a chilling certainty that she was no longer just a player trying to survive. She was now the one holding all the cards. Clara sat on the dusty floor of the hidden room, the single beam of light from the one-way mirror illuminating the diary of Arthur Vance. Her fingers, stained with grime, trembled as she turned the brittle, whispering pages. The air was thick with the scent of ancient paper and dried ink, a smell of locked-away truths. The first entries were clinical, filled with geological jargon and precise drawings of rock formations. But as she read deeper into the year 1955, the tone began to shift. A new excitement bled through the scientific prose. Incredible! Preliminary tests confirm a significant vein of high-grade iron ore directly beneath the old farmlands. A deposit of this magnitude could reshape the entire region's economy. It is a generational discovery. Clara's heart began to beat faster, a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She felt a phantom vibration from the pages, the ghost of Arthur Vance's own racing pulse as he stood on the precipice of a great revelation. This book was not just a record, it was the chronicle of a discovery that should have made history. She turned another page, and the name appeared for the first time, written in the same neat script, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure. Blackwood. The entry read, "Met with Silas Blackwood today to discuss the survey results. He is the primary landowner, having recently consolidated the deeds from the local farmers. He has a politician's charm, but his eyes, they are like chips of cold slate. He seemed more interested in the exact boundaries of the find than its potential for the community. A disturbing avarice hangs about him like a cheap cologne." A chill snaked down Clara's spine, the words on the page painting a vivid picture of a man she had never met, a ghost whose legacy now loomed over her life. She could almost feel the coldness of his gaze across the decades. The documents in the folder suddenly felt heavier, colder. She wasn't just reading about a mineral discovery. She was reading the prelude to a crime, the first notes in a symphony of greed and corruption that had been playing for over half a century. Her own poverty felt suddenly connected to this man's ancient ambition. The entries grew more frequent, more urgent. The scientific detachment was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread and suspicion. Something is wrong with the deeds. I spent the day in the city clerk's archives. The signatures from the farmers. Many are crude, almost identical marks. The transfer dates are all clustered within a single week. It feels rushed. It feels fraudulent. It feels like grillagem, a land grab of the most audacious scale. Silas Blackwood didn't buy this land. He stole it from men who couldn't read the papers they were signing. Clara felt a wave of nausea. The injustice was so raw, so palpable, it felt like a fresh wound. She thought of the farmers, men like her own grandfather, their hands calloused from work, their trust stolen by a man with cold eyes and a smooth tongue. She glanced at the affidavits in the folder, the signed testimonies of people who must have suspected, people Vance had found. He wasn't just a geologist, he had become an investigator, a lone champion for the dispossessed, digging for truth instead of iron. The paranoia became a living thing on the page, the ink seeming to tremble with Arthur Vance's fear. He knows I know. I saw his car parked down the street from my boarding house last night. A long black sedan. It just sat there, watching. I've moved my research, my proof to a secure location. This room, soundproofed. A hidden entrance. Only I know the way in. If something happens to me, the truth is here. It is all here. The original survey, the forged deeds, the affidavits. Everything needed to burn the Blackwood Empire to the ground. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She was sitting in that secure location. She was the inheritor of his desperate, terrified foresight. This room was not a hideaway. It was a dead man's switch, a final, defiant testament designed to outlive its creator. The profound silence of the soundproofed walls suddenly felt heavy, filled with the ghost of a man waiting for a justice that never came. The weight on her chest was immense, the responsibility almost too much to bear. The final entry was dated October 17, 1955. It consisted of only 3 words, scrawled hastily, the handwriting shaky and barely legible, as if written by a man in the final moments of his life. The words were stark, a final, chilling bulletin from the edge of the abyss. He is here. That was it. The rest of the page was blank. The diary ended. The story stopped. Arthur Vance, a good man who had discovered a fortune and uncovered a crime, was silenced. A cold so deep it felt like it was freezing her marrow spread through Clara's body. She closed the diary, the soft thud of the cover echoing like a coffin lid closing in the silent room. The dry, dusty air now felt like tomb air. She held in her hands the proof of a theft and a probable murder, a secret sealed for nearly 70 years. The knowledge was a poison, a fire, a burden. It was too big for her. The Blackwood name, a name she'd seen on campaign signs, was not just a name of wealth. It was a name stained with blood and lies. She was terrified. Clara stumbled out of the hidden room, the diary and the folder clutched to her chest like a shield. The air in the attic, once foul and oppressive, now felt fresh, normal. She gently pushed the hidden door until it clicked shut, the seam once again almost invisible. She needed to hide the documents, to put them somewhere safe before she could even begin to think. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind of fear and furious calculation. The name Alistair Blackwood screamed in her thoughts. The mayoral candidate, the charismatic public figure, the grandson of Silas Blackwood, and, according to the impersonal email she had received, the current owner of this building. He was her landlord. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had bought her tomb from the descendants of the man who had created it. A sharp, sudden knock on the attic door made her jump so violently that she almost dropped the precious folder. Her heart exploded in her chest, a frantic, painful hammering that stole her breath. The knock came again, louder this time, sharper, more insistent. It was a knock of authority, not of polite inquiry. It was the sound of someone who was not used to waiting. Leo and Sophia, who had been playing quietly in their makeshift tent, fell silent, their wide eyes fixed on the door and then on their mother's terrified face. "Who is it?" Clara called out, her voice a weak, trembling thing she barely recognized. She shoved the diary and folder under her mattress, her hands clumsy with panic. The thick paper of the folder felt dangerously conspicuous, a block of evidence under the thin, worn blanket. "Mrs. Jensen, my name is Alistair Blackwood. I own the building. I was in the area and wanted to personally welcome you and see if you were settling in all right." The voice that came through the door was smooth, cultured, and laced with a disarming warmth that did nothing to soothe the frantic terror clawing at Clara's throat. It was the voice of a predator cloaked in the wool of a gentle sheep. It was the voice of power. Taking a shaky breath, she forced her legs to move. She couldn't refuse to open the door. That would be more suspicious. Her hand trembled as she turned the cold, greasy brass knob. The man standing in the gloomy hallway was exactly as he appeared on his campaign posters, but infinitely more intimidating in person. Alistair Blackwood was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that probably cost more than Clara had earned in the last 5 years. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his smile was a dazzling, practiced display of white teeth. But his eyes, a pale, piercing blue, held no warmth at all. They were chips of cold slate, just as Arthur Vance had described his grandfather's. His gaze swept over her, taking in her stained clothes and disheveled appearance, and then moved past her to scan the squalid attic. A flicker of something, distaste, satisfaction, crossed his face before it was replaced by the mask of practiced concern. "Oh my," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The listing certainly didn't do this place justice, did it?" He stepped inside without being invited, his expensive, polished leather shoes making no sound on the grimy floorboards. He brought with him the faint, clean scent of expensive cologne and money, an aroma so alien in this space of mold and decay that it felt like a violation. "This is quite the project you've taken on, Mrs. Jensen," he continued, his gaze methodically cataloging every sign of decay, the dripping ceiling, the peeling wallpaper, the treacherous wiring. His polite words were a sharp contrast to the cold, analytical assessment in his eyes. He was not seeing a home. He was inspecting a liability, a loose end. Clara felt her entire body go rigid. She stood frozen by the door, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her fingernails digging into her palms. The desperate urge to protect the secret hidden under her mattress was a physical force, a burning heat in her chest. She felt like a mouse being calmly observed by a hawk. Every move she made, every breath she took, being measured and judged by a patient predator. His piercing blue eyes finally settled on Leo and Sophia, who were peeking out from their makeshift tent, their faces pale with apprehension. Alistair's smile softened, a calculated shift designed to disarm. And these must be your children. It's a crime that a family should have to live in such conditions. The word crime hung in the air, a poisoned dart aimed directly at Clara's heart. He knew. He had to know. Maybe not everything, but he knew this attic was more than just a derelict space. The family legends mentioned in the premise. He was fishing, testing her. She felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. Her throat was so tight she couldn't have spoken if she'd wanted to. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement. He took a step closer to her, lowering his voice to a confidential, almost conspiratorial tone. This building, you see, it has a lot of history. My family has owned it for generations. Some might say it's full of old ghosts, old secrets. He was looking directly at her, his smile unwavering, but his eyes were sharp, probing, trying to see past her fear. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Jensen," Alistair said, his voice a smooth, reasonable purr. "When my office was notified of the sale, I was quite concerned. This unit was never meant for habitation. It's not safe." He gestured vaguely at the drooping, frayed wires snaking along the wall. "My grandfather, Silas, always said this attic was problematic. He sealed it off for a reason." He let the name hang in the air, watching her face for a reaction. Clara's blood ran cold. He was confirming it. He was telling her, in his own coded way, that he knew what this place was. He knew there was something to be sealed off. Her mind raced. The online ad, the impossibly low price, the quick, impersonal sale. It had all been a trap. Not a trap to get rid of the attic, but a trap to lure out anyone desperate enough to buy it. A baited hook to see who might come sniffing around the family's oldest, darkest secret, and she had swallowed it whole. She felt a wave of dizziness, the room seeming to tilt around her. She had walked right into the lion's den, and the lion was now smiling at her. He took another step closer, invading her personal space. The scent of his cologne was suffocating. "Look," he said, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous generosity. "I feel responsible. I can't have a family, children, living in these conditions under a roof owned by a Blackwood. It's a matter of public image, you understand?" He produced a sleek, leather-bound checkbook from his inner jacket pocket. The gesture was theatrical, designed to impress and intimidate. "I am prepared to buy the attic back from you, right now. I'll even give you a little extra for your trouble. Let's say $2,000, enough for a deposit on a proper, safe apartment for you and your lovely children." The offer was an insult wrapped in a condescending smile. $2,000. It was nothing. It was a pittance designed to make her feel small and desperate, to remind her of her place. He wasn't offering help. He was offering hush money. He was trying to buy her silence, to buy back the secret she now possessed. And he was starting with the lowest possible price. Clara stared at the checkbook, her mind numb with shock and a rising tide of furious indignation. The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking. He stood in the ruin he had sold her, a ruin that was a monument to his family's crimes, and offered her pennies to disappear. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but now it was mingled with a hot, defiant anger. She thought of Arthur Vance. She thought of the cheated farmers. She thought of her own children, huddled in the corner. Her voice, when she finally found it, was steadier than she expected. "No," she said. The word was small, but it felt massive, a rock thrown against a tank. "No, thank you, Mr. Blackwood. We're fine." Alistair's smile tightened just a fraction of an inch, the first crack in his polished facade. His pale blue eyes narrowed, the counterfeit warmth disappearing completely, leaving only the cold, hard slate beneath. The air in the attic grew thick, heavy with unspoken threats. The game had begun, and she had just made her first move. His pleasant demeanor vanished in an instant, replaced by a calm, predatory stillness. "I don't think you understand, Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "This building is old, very old. It's not structurally sound. My engineers are recommending it be demolished before the whole thing collapses." He let that sink in, his eyes never leaving hers. Old buildings like this, they have all sorts of problems. Faulty wiring, for instance. He paused, his gaze deliberately drifting from the exposed wires on the wall to the mattresses where her children were. It's amazing how easily a fire can start in a place like this. A stray spark, a bit of old, dry timber. It would all go up so fast. A real tragedy. The threat was no longer veiled. It was as clear and as sharp as a shard of glass held to her throat. He wasn't talking about a hypothetical accident. He was making a promise. The metallic taste of pure terror flooded Clara's mouth. Her heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. Alistair slowly pocketed his checkbook, the mask of the charming politician slipping back into place. But it was a grotesque, ill-fitting thing now. His eyes, however, remained cold and hard. As he turned to leave, he stopped, his gaze lingering for a long, deliberate moment on the far wall, the wall with the massive, tarnished mirror. He didn't say a word, but his meaning was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. He knew where the secret was, or at least, he knew where to look. He gave her one last, thin smile. "Think about my offer, Mrs. Jensen. It's for the best, for everyone." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the spiral staircase, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than his words. Clara stood frozen, her body trembling uncontrollably, the diary and folder under her mattress feeling like a ticking bomb. She held the evidence of a historic crime, and the monster at the center of it knew she had it. He would stop at nothing to protect his family's legacy. What would you do in her place? Would you hand over the secret for the safety of your children? Or would you risk everything to fight for a justice that was 70 years overdue? The silence Alistair Blackwood left behind was a living entity, a suffocating pressure that was heavier and more menacing than his physical presence had ever been. Clara stood trembling in the center of the attic, the ghost of his cologne still hanging in the stale air, a violation of her squalid sanctuary. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs, each frantic flutter a testament to the chilling finality of his threat. A fire. The words echoed in her mind, painting vivid, horrific images of smoke and screams, of her children trapped by flames in this derelict tinderbox. The rhythmic plink, plonk of the dripping water, once a sound of decay, now sounded like a timer, a sinister countdown to her family's annihilation. The attic was no longer a disappointing home. It was a cage, and the keeper of that cage had just informed her he had the key and the matches. Her entire body was slick with a cold sweat, and the metallic taste of pure, undiluted terror was a bitter coating on her tongue. Her first instinct was to run, to grab her children and the damning evidence under her mattress, and simply vanish into the anonymous streets of the city. But the image of Alistair's cold, slate-blue eyes stopped her. He was not a man who would allow loose ends. He would hunt them. He had the resources, the power, the utter lack of conscience to track down a destitute seamstress and her 2 children. Running without a plan was not an escape. It was merely a delay of the inevitable. She felt a surge of desperate, furious energy. She would not be a passive victim. She would not let him erase them. Her gaze fell to the floor, to the dark, damp floorboards that separated her from the apartment below. She had heard faint sounds from there, the shuffle of slippers, the muted cough of an old man. It was a faint hope, a straw in a hurricane, but it was the only hope she had. She needed an ally, someone who knew this building, someone who had lived under the shadow of the Blackwood name longer than she had. The decision made, Clara moved with a new, feverish purpose. She pulled the thick folder and the diary from under the mattress. The weight of the paper felt immense, a physical manifestation of the danger she now carried. She tucked the precious cargo under her loose coat, the stiff edges of the folder digging into her ribs like a constant, painful reminder of the stakes. She whispered to Leo, her voice low and urgent, "Stay with your sister. Don't make a sound. I will be right back." The fear and confusion in his eyes was a fresh stab to her heart, but she had no time for reassurance. She crept to the attic door, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. The journey down the main spiral staircase was a descent into a fresh layer of hell. Every groan of the ancient wood under her weight sounded like a gunshot in the vast, silent lobby. The air grew colder, and she clutched the documents tighter, her body rigid with the fear that Alistair or his men could be waiting in any of the deep shadows that clung to the corners. She reached the landing on the floor below and found the door. It was identical to her own, but here the paint was less cracked, the brass knob less tarnished. A small, neatly calligraphed card was tacked to the wood. E. Thorn. Her knuckles, as she raised them to knock, were white and trembling. The sound of her rap was pathetic, a tiny, timid plea against the heavy oak. She held her breath, listening. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. Then, she heard it. A slow, dragging shuffle from within, the sound of old age and weariness. A series of metallic clicks echoed, and the door opened a few inches, stopped short by the reassuring rattle of a thick brass security chain. A single, watery blue eye, clouded with age but surprisingly sharp, peered out at her from the gloom. The face was a road map of wrinkles, the skin as thin and fragile as old parchment. "Yes," the voice rasped, thin and dry like rustling leaves. "You're the new woman. From the attic." "Please," Clara whispered, the word a ragged exhalation of pure desperation. "I need your help. I'm in trouble. Terrible trouble." The old man's eye narrowed, his gaze flickering from her panicked face down to the unnatural bulge under her coat, then back up again. He saw the genuine terror etched there, the frantic edge of a woman pushed far beyond her limit. The words tumbled out of her in a frantic, disjointed torrent. "It's Alistair Blackwood. He was just here. He threatened me. He threatened my children. He knows. About the room. The mirror." At the mention of the name Blackwood, a visible change came over the old man. It wasn't surprise. It was a deep, weary resignation. The look of a man seeing a ghost he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The caution in his eyes was replaced by a sudden, sharp alarm. With fumbling, trembling fingers, he slid the chain free. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice gaining a sudden, unexpected strength. Quickly, he pulled her into the apartment and immediately shut and bolted the door, the heavy thud of the lock a deeply comforting sound. The contrast between his home and her attic was staggering and immediate, where her world was damp, dark, and filled with the stench of decay. His was warm, dry, and impeccably neat. The air smelled of lemon polish, old books, and the faint, soothing aroma of chamomile tea brewing in the kitchen. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with neatly organized volumes. A majestic grandfather clock stood in the corner, its steady, rhythmic ticking a calming counterpoint to the frantic drumming in her chest. This was a sanctuary, a small, ordered island of civilization in a sea of neglect. Mr. Thorne, his frail body wrapped in a worn but clean wool cardigan, guided her to a plush armchair, his touch surprisingly firm on her elbow. "Sit," he said. "Tell me everything, from the beginning, and do not leave a single detail out." Clara's story poured out of her, a confession and a plea. She spoke of the one-way mirror, the unnatural coldness of the glass, Leo's discovery of the flicker of movement behind it. She described finding the hidden door, prying it open with the crowbar, and the perfectly preserved, sound-proofed room within. Her voice trembled as she described the diary of Arthur Vance, the geological surveys, and the affidavits. She pulled the folder from her coat and laid it on the polished coffee table between them like a sacred offering. Finally, she recounted Alistair Blackwood's visit, his smooth, condescending offer, and the final, chilling threat of a fire. As she spoke, she watched Mr. Thorne's face. The color drained from his already pale cheeks, leaving his skin a waxy, translucent gray. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, clenched and unclenched. He wasn't just listening to a story. He was reliving a memory, a nightmare from his distant past. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Mr. Thorne stared at the manila folder on the table, his eyes wide with a look of profound, horrified recognition. He slowly reached out a trembling hand and touched the cover, as if confirming it were real. "Arthur Vance," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "My God, after all these years." He looked up at Clara, his watery eyes now sharp with a terrible clarity. "I was a boy then," he said, his voice barely audible, "a junior clerk in the city archives, just 20 years old. I filed those deeds." The confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. We all knew something was wrong. Silas Blackwood came in with a stack of transfers, all signed with an X, all notarized by the same corrupt judge. He smelled of power and greed. We were just kids, told to stamp the papers and keep our mouths shut, to ask no questions. He stood and began to pace the small room, his slow shuffle now filled with a restless, agitated energy. And I remember Arthur Vance, he continued, his voice gaining strength, fueled by a righteous anger that had been simmering for 65 years. He was a decent man, an honest scientist. He came to the archives, asking about those very deeds. He was polite, but persistent. He knew. He was putting the pieces together. Elias stopped and looked at Clara, his expression grim. Then one day, he was just gone. The official story was that he'd taken a new job in another state, left in a hurry. But those of us who had spoken to him, we knew that was a lie. You don't get that close to exposing a man like Silas Blackwood and just decide to leave town. You get removed. The implication was terrifyingly clear. Arthur Vance had not been silenced. He had been erased. The hidden room was not just his office. It was his tombstone, and these documents were his last will and testament. Elias sank back into his chair, the burst of energy leaving him looking even more frail and ancient. And Alistair, he said, the name tasting like poison. He is his grandfather's son in every way that matters. I've watched him my whole life. He has the same ambition, the same charisma, and the same soulless reptilian core. This mayoral run, it's the final move in their game. It's to gain ultimate control of the city, to ensure that secrets like the one in that folder stay buried forever. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He will not make you a second offer, Mrs. Jensen. His threat was not a negotiating tactic. It was a promise. If you do not give him what he wants, he will burn that attic to the ground with you and your children inside, and he will sleep like a baby that same night. The Blackwoods don't leave witnesses. They never have. His words landed like stones in the pit of her stomach, extinguishing the last embers of her naive hope that this could be resolved peacefully. He revealed the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. After Arthur Vance disappeared, Elias said, his voice a low, haunted murmur, Silas Blackwood himself oversaw the renovations on this building, which he had conveniently acquired as part of his land grab. I heard the workers talking. They weren't renovating. They were building something on the top floor, a special room. They were ordered to seal it, to make it disappear from all the building's plans. Your attic, Mrs. Jensen, it wasn't just forgotten. It was deliberately left to rot. It became a monument to his crime and a mausoleum for the truth, guarded by a malevolent one-way mirror. He kept it as a trophy, a constant, private reminder of his power and his victory. The story was complete now, a perfect, horrifying circle of greed, theft, and murder. Clara felt a profound, sickening sense of violation. She wasn't just living in a derelict attic. She was living inside the architecture of a crime, a space designed by a monster. The weight of Elias Thorne's revelation settled on Clara not like a blanket, but like a lead apron. The danger was no longer a vague premonition. It was a concrete, ticking certainty. Alistair Blackwood was not a man who would be deterred by a locked door or a no. He was the scion of a legacy built on ruthless action, and she was now the single greatest threat to that legacy. The neat, quiet safety of Elias's apartment felt like a temporary bubble in a stormy sea. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in her throat, but she forced it down, replacing it with a grim, icy resolve. She looked at the old man, whose face was a mask of fear and righteous fury. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "He will come back. Tonight." Elias nodded, his frail hands trembling slightly. "There is someone," he said slowly. "A federal prosecutor, a good woman. She has been quietly building a corruption case against Alistair for months, but her case is circumstantial. Your evidence, this," he gestured to the folder, "this is the bedrock. This is everything. But we cannot just walk into her office. We have to be smart. We have to be careful." Clara returned to the attic, her body moving with a strange, numb automatonism. The documents were safely tucked back under her coat. The air in her squalid home felt different now, charged with imminent violence. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more menacing. She saw her children huddled in their makeshift tent of sheets, their faces pale and worried. The sight sent a surge of fierce, primal protectiveness through her. These were her cubs, and the wolf was circling. She knelt before them, forcing a calm she was nowhere near feeling. "We're going to play a game," she whispered, her voice a low, steady hum. "It's called the super quiet game. No matter what sounds you hear, you cannot make a peep. Can you do that for Mommy?" Sophia nodded solemnly, her wide eyes trusting. Leo just stared at her, his gaze too old, his expression telling her he knew this was no game. She took a deep breath, the mold-scented air doing little to calm her racing heart, and dragged a rickety wooden chair to brace under the doorknob, a pathetically flimsy barricade against the coming storm. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Time itself seemed to warp, stretching and compressing. Every minute that passed was a small victory, another moment of safety. Every creak of the old building's bones was a footstep on the stairs. The sun began to set, and the single, grime-caked window, their only source of light, slowly faded from gray to black. The oppressive gloom of the attic deepened into an absolute, suffocating darkness, broken only by the faint, cold glow of her phone screen as she clutched it in her hand. Elias's number was already dialed, her thumb hovering over the call button. The rhythmic drip of the water from the ceiling was a maddening metronome, each drop a hammer blow against her frayed nerves. She sat with her back against the wall, her children curled against her, and listened. She listened for the sound of the end of her world approaching. She strained her ears, trying to separate the normal groans of the ancient structure from the sounds of deliberate, more malevolent approach. Then it came. It wasn't the polite, authoritative knock of Alistair Blackwood. It was a heavy, violent banging that shook the entire door in its frame. The sound was a physical assault, a brutal announcement of force. "Fire inspection!" a rough voice shouted, the words muffled by the thick wood. "Emergency! Open the door now!" The voice was guttural, angry, stripped of all pretense. There was no attempt at subtlety. This was not a request. It was a demand backed by the promise of violence. Clara's heart didn't just pound. It stopped. For one terrifying, breathless second, all the air was sucked out of the room. The moment she had been dreading was here. They had come for her. They had come for the secret she possessed. She instinctively wrapped her arms tighter around her children, her body forming a fragile, human shield around them. Leo whimpered softly, and she pressed a finger to his lips, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea for him to remember their game. Another series of thunderous blows rained down on the door, each one making the flimsy chair she'd propped against it jump. "We know you're in there, Jensen. Open this door. We have an order to check for a gas leak." The lie was as clumsy as it was transparent. There was no gas in this part of the building. The men on the other side were not inspectors. They were thugs, hired muscle sent to retrieve the documents and eliminate the problem. Clara's mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of terror and survival instinct. The plan. She had to stick to the plan. Her hand, slick with a cold sweat, shook so violently she could barely hold her phone. With a trembling thumb, she pressed the call button. The phone didn't even have a chance to complete a full ring before Elias answered, his voice a tense, breathless whisper. "Clara!" The sound of splintering wood exploded from her door as she spoke. "They're here," she choked out, her voice a strangled gasp. "They're breaking in." "The window," Elias's voice came back, sharp and commanding, cutting through her panic. "The fire escape. Your only way out. Go now, Clara. Don't hesitate. I'm on my way to the lobby. Go." The line went dead. The finality of his command jolted her out of her frozen terror. Another deafening crash came from the door. A long, vertical crack appeared in the wood near the lock. They were using a tool, something heavy, a crowbar. The irony was not lost on her, a bitter, acidic taste in her mouth. She had used a crowbar to uncover a 70-year-old crime, and now they were using one to bury her with it. The adrenaline she had been holding back flooded her system in a powerful, clarifying wave. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in her gut, but it was now fuel for action. She scrambled to her feet, pulling the children up with her. "Come on," she said, her voice a fierce, low command. "We have to go. Now." She lunged for the mattress, her hands finding the precious folder and diary in the darkness. She shoved them into the cheap canvas tote bag she'd been using for groceries, the irony of it almost making her laugh hysterically. Her family's salvation and the downfall of an empire were now nestled next to a receipt for bread and apples. She grabbed Leo's and Sophia's hands, their small fingers cold and trembling in hers. "Stay close to me," she commanded, pulling them toward the far wall, toward the single, grimy window that was their only hope. The window was their gateway to the fire escape, a rickety, rusted structure she had only glimpsed from the street. It was a terrifying prospect, but the sound of the door frame beginning to splinter and give way behind them was infinitely more terrifying. The men were shouting now, their voices raw with frustration and anger. They were almost through. She reached the window and fumbled in the darkness for the latch. Her fingers, numb and clumsy with haste, found the small metal lever. It was coated in a thick, gritty layer of rust and grime. She pushed. It didn't move. She threw her entire body weight against it, her shoulder slamming into the frame. The latch was frozen solid, rusted shut by decades of rain and neglect. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over her, threatening to drown the fire of her adrenaline. They were trapped. The back door was a lie. A loud, splintering crack from behind her signaled the death of the door lock. The flimsy chair skittered across the floor. The door was beginning to swing inward. They had seconds. Her eyes darted around the dark room in a desperate search for a weapon, a tool, anything. Her gaze fell upon the small, red toolbox lying near the wall, its lid still ajar. The crowbar, her crowbar. The key that had opened the past was now the key to her future. Without a second of hesitation, she snatched the heavy iron pry bar from the toolbox. The solid, cold weight of it in her hand was a small comfort, a tangible piece of her own agency in a world that had spiraled out of her control. She did not aim for the latch. There was no time. Turning back to the window, she drew her arm back and swung with all the force her fear and adrenaline could muster. The crowbar connected with the glass pane with an explosive crack that was louder than any gunshot. The glass didn't just shatter, it detonated, spraying the floor with a deadly rain of glittering shards. A sudden, violent gust of cold night air and the distant sound of city sirens rushed into the suffocating attic, a blast from the outside world. The sound of the shattering window made the men at the door pause for a crucial second, their shouts replaced by a moment of surprised silence. It was the only opening she would get. "Cover your eyes," she screamed at the children. She used the end of the crowbar to smash out the remaining jagged teeth of glass from the wooden frame. The tinkling sound of the falling shards a strange, delicate music against the brutal backdrop of their escape. The frame was clear. A dark, rectangular hole now gaped in the wall, a portal to a terrifying vertical world of rusted iron and open air. She looked at Leo and Sophia, their faces illuminated in the fleeting strobing lights of a passing ambulance far below. They were pale, their eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. But there was no time for comfort, no time for gentle words. She grabbed the tote bag containing the documents. "The bag goes first," she thought, a moment of strange clarity in the chaos. She tossed it out of the window, hearing it land with a soft thud on the metal platform of the fire escape below. The evidence was out. Now, she had to get her children out. She turned to Sophia, who was crying silently, her small body trembling. "Sophia, you have to be brave," Clara said, her voice firm but shaking. She lifted her daughter, who felt as fragile as a bird, and carefully passed her through the jagged opening. "Hold on to the railing, sweetie. Hold on tight and don't let go." Sophia's small hands gripped the cold, rusted metal bar of the fire escape, her knuckles white. Next was Leo. He didn't need to be told. His face was a grim mask of determination. He scrambled through the window with a surprising agility, his movements quick and sure. He immediately grabbed his sister's hand, his role as protector kicking in even in the midst of this nightmare. The shouts from the attic resumed, louder now, angrier. "She's going out the window. Stop her." Heavy footsteps thundered across the floorboards towards them. Clara scrambled through the window last, on her body clumsy with haste. A sharp, burning pain shot up her leg as a remaining shard of glass in the frame sliced through her jeans and deep into her calf. She gasped, but ignored the pain, pulling herself onto the narrow, swaying platform. The wind was a physical force out here, whipping her hair across her face and chilling her to the bone. The fire escape groaned and shifted under their combined weight. the sound of protesting metal a terrifying accompaniment to their frantic escape. The alleyway below was a dark, bottomless canyon. For a horrifying second, vertigo threatened to overwhelm her. She looked back. A large, brutish silhouette filled the broken window frame, a hand reaching out for her. The man's face was a snarl of fury. The sight broke her paralysis. She grabbed her children, one on each side, and started down the ladder. The descent was a blind, terrifying scramble into darkness. The iron rungs of the fire escape were slick with a greasy film of grime and moisture, and each one seemed to sag and groan under her weight. The structure swayed with every step, a rusted, skeletal beast trying to shake them from its back. The rough brick of the building wall scraped against her shoulder. The sounds from above were a terrifying mixture of shouts and the heavy clanging of a man trying to force his large body through the narrow window frame. Clara didn't dare look down. She focused only on the next rung, and the one after that, her hand guiding Leo, her other arm wrapped securely around Sophia. Her own breathing was a ragged, painful gasp in her ears. The pain in her leg was a dull, hot throb. They were exposed, vulnerable, suspended between the hell they had fled and the unforgiving pavement far below. They moved with a desperate speed, their flight a frantic, vertical ballet of terror. Leo was surprisingly strong, his small hands gripping the rails with a sureness that belied his age. Sophia clung to Clara, her face buried in her mother's coat, her small body shaking uncontrollably. The shouts from above grew more distant, replaced by the sound of their own panicked breathing and the relentless, rhythmic creaking of the ancient metal. Clara's arms and legs burned with a fiery exhaustion, but she pushed onward, driven by the pure, primal instinct to get her children to safety. The image of the man's furious face in the window was burned into her mind, a powerful fuel for her flight. Each rung down was another foot away from him, another inch closer to survival. The alley floor, once a terrifying abyss, was slowly rising to meet them, the shadows beginning to resolve into the shapes of dumpsters and discarded boxes. With a final, jarring step, Clara's foot touched solid ground. The relief was so profound, so absolute, that her legs almost buckled beneath her. They were down. They were at the bottom. She pulled her children into the deeper shadows of a recessed doorway, her body trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion and the sharp, throbbing pain in her leg. She looked up. The fire escape swayed above them, a dark, skeletal ladder against the starless, light-polluted sky. There was no sign of the men. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe they were safe. The alley was a canyon of brick and shadow, smelling of wet garbage and urban decay. It was grimy and foul, but it was solid ground. It was freedom. She clutched her children to her, their small, trembling bodies a fragile, precious weight against her own. She could feel Leo's heart hammering in time with hers. The illusion of safety was shattered by a new sound, a sound that sent a fresh jolt of ice water through her veins. It was the sound of a heavy door being thrown open at the far end of the alley, spilling a rectangle of yellow light onto the wet pavement. Footsteps, heavy, running footsteps, echoed off the brick walls, coming their way. They hadn't given up. They were coming around. Panic seized her again, cold and suffocating. There was nowhere else to run, nowhere to hide. The alley was a dead end, a brick-and-mortar trap. She frantically scanned the darkness, her eyes searching for any possible escape route, any doorway, any opening. There was nothing, just solid, unyielding brick walls. This was it. They were cornered. She pulled her children behind a large, overflowing dumpster, her mind screaming. After everything they had been through, to be caught here, in this filthy, dead-end alley, was a cruelly ironic end. Just as the running footsteps grew closer, a different sound cut through the night. A low, insistent squeal of tires, followed by the roar of an engine. Headlights flooded the alley, pinning them in their harsh, white glare like terrified animals. Clara froze, shielding her children's eyes, her heart sinking. It was him. It was Alistair. He had come to finish the job himself. But the car that screeched to a halt, blocking the alley's entrance and trapping the approaching thugs in its headlights, wasn't a sleek black sedan. It was an old, battered station wagon, a relic from another era. The driver's side door flew open, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the bright lights. It was not a brutish thug or a cold-eyed politician. It was the frail, stooped form of Mr. Elias Thorne, his face grim and set with a resolve that seemed to add inches to his height. In his hand, he held not a weapon, but a small, old-fashioned flip phone, its screen glowing. "Get in the car!" he yelled, his voice cracking but filled with an undeniable authority. "Now!" The station wagon's engine roared, a desperate, guttural sound that filled the narrow alley. Tires squealed on the wet pavement as Elias wrenched the wheel, the car lurching forward. Clara scrambled into the back seat, pulling Leo and Sophia in after her, the motion sending a fresh, blinding wave of pain up her injured leg. The car smelled powerfully of old vinyl, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of Elias's pipe tobacco, a bizarrely comforting aroma in the midst of chaos. Through the rear window, she saw the two thugs, momentarily blinded and confused by the sudden headlights, shielding their faces. The car fishtailed, its tires finding purchase, and they shot out of the alley and into the anonymous flow of city traffic. The flashing red and blue lights they had heard before were now closer, growing in intensity, but they weren't converging on their location. Clara clutched her children, their small, trembling bodies pressed against her. The bag of evidence was a hard, solid lump on the seat beside her, a heavy anchor of truth in a sea of terror. The city lights blurred into long neon streaks, a river of light carrying them away from the darkness. Elias didn't drive toward his apartment. He navigated the city's arteries with a surprising, focused calm, his gnarled hands steady on the wheel. He drove them to a quiet, forgotten corner of the city, pulling up to a 24-hour diner that glowed with a lonely, fluorescent light. "I will be safe here," he said, his voice still raspy but firm. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and sizzling bacon grease, a mundane reality that felt impossibly safe. He led them to a cracked vinyl booth in the back corner. Clara's leg throbbed with a dull, insistent beat, but the immediate terror had subsided, replaced by a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion. Elias placed his old flip phone on the sticky tabletop. "I called her before I came to get you," he explained, his watery eyes meeting hers. "Her name is Elena Ramirez. She's a federal prosecutor. She's on her way." The words landed with a quiet, profound weight. It was happening. The burden was about to be shared. Clara felt a single, hot tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of fear or sadness, but of an emotion she hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Relief. 20 minutes later, a sensible sedan pulled into the diner's parking lot. A woman stepped out, her movements economical and precise. This was Elena Ramirez. She wasn't dressed in a power suit, but in practical slacks and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and carried an aura of calm, unshakable authority. She slid into the booth opposite them, her dark eyes taking in the scene with a quick, comprehensive sweep. Clara's torn and bloodied jeans, the children's pale, exhausted faces, Elias's grim determination. She offered a small, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mrs. Jensen, Mr. Thorne, I'm glad you're safe." Her voice was low and steady, a calming frequency in the chaotic noise of Clara's mind. She placed a small, digital recorder on the table. "I need you to tell me everything," she said, her gaze settling on Clara. "Don't leave anything out." It wasn't a demand, but an invitation. For the first time, Clara felt she wasn't screaming into a void. She was speaking to someone who had the power to make the world listen. Clara spoke, her voice hoarse and cracking at first, then gaining strength as she recounted the entire nightmare. The story, which had felt like a mad, paranoid delusion in her own head, sounded like a coherent, damning indictment when spoken aloud in the diner's sterile light. When she finished, she pushed the canvas tote bag across the table. With a reverence that felt almost holy, Elena Ramirez pulled out the old leather diary and the thick manila folder. She didn't need to read every page. She untied the faded red string and her eyes scanned the top few documents: the geological survey, the first fraudulent deed with Silas Blackwood's name, a signed affidavit. A grim, cold satisfaction settled on her features. She looked up from the papers, her eyes locking with Clara's. "For a year we've been chasing whispers and shadows," she said, her voice a low, intense murmur. "We had financial crimes, corruption, but nothing that could touch the heart of the Blackwood legacy. She gently tapped the cover of Arthur Vance's diary. "This," she said, the word resonating with the weight of impending justice, "is the heart. This is the cornerstone. You've given us the whole damn story." The mayoral debate was the crown jewel of Alistair Blackwood's campaign. He stood on a brightly lit stage, bathed in the warm glow of television lights, the picture of civic virtue. His voice, smooth and resonant, filled the auditorium as he spoke of integrity, family values, and a brighter future for the city. The applause from the audience was a warm, reassuring wave. He was untouchable, a king surveying his domain moments before his coronation. It was during his opponent's rebuttal that the auditorium doors at the back swung open. The disruption was quiet at first. Two men in dark suits walking purposefully down the center aisle. A murmur rippled through the room. Alistair paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his perfect face. As the agent stepped onto the stage, the moderator fell silent. One of the agents approached Alistair, his voice inaudible, but his actions brutally clear. He presented the warrant. The metallic click of the handcuffs being fastened around Alistair Blackwood's wrists was picked up by the stage microphone. A tiny, sharp sound that echoed like a gunshot, signaling the instantaneous and spectacular collapse of an empire. The arrest was the pebble that started an avalanche. The media erupted. The contents of Arthur Vance's diary and the fraudulent deeds became front-page news, a sordid, captivating tale of multi-generational crime. The name Blackwood, once a symbol of power and prestige, was now synonymous with theft and murder. Federal investigators, armed with the irrefutable evidence from the hidden room, unraveled a 70-year conspiracy, exposing a web of corruption that reached into every corner of the city's government. The Blackwood family's assets were frozen, their political allies disgraced. In a small, crowded room, Elias Thorne, no longer a frail, forgotten clerk, gave a dignified and powerful press conference, his testimony providing the human context to the dry legal documents. Inspired by the revelations, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the farmers whose lands had been stolen came forward, forming a class action lawsuit that would rewrite the history of the region and seek to reclaim a fortune built on a bedrock of lies. The scales of justice, so long tilted in one direction, were finally, violently, swinging back. Clara Jensen was not forgotten in the storm. Hailed by the press as the Attic Avenger, she became a reluctant hero, a symbol of how one ordinary person's courage could topple a dynasty. The city, facing its own legal culpability and eager for a public relations victory, moved quickly. To avoid a massive lawsuit and in recognition of her role, they offered a settlement. It was a profound act of restitution. Clara sat in a bright, modern office, the smell of clean paper and leather filling the air. A lawyer slid a document across a polished mahogany desk towards her. It was a deed. Her fingers, no longer trembling, traced the crisp, embossed seal. It granted her full legal ownership of a renovated two-bedroom luxury apartment in the now historically protected building. Alongside it came a substantial reward from the seized Blackwood assets, a sum so large it felt unreal, an amount that guaranteed her children would never know the gnawing ache of hunger or the cold fear of homelessness ever again. The weight of the world, it seemed, had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Returning to the building felt like stepping into a different reality. The heavy oak door now opened into a lobby filled with light, its stone floors polished to a mirror shine. The grand staircase, once a dusty spiral into darkness, had been restored to its former glory, the wood glowing warmly under new sun-elegant light fixtures. There was no oppressive smell of mold or decay. The air was clean and fresh, filled with the faint scent of lemon polish. Clara, Leo, and Sophia didn't climb to the top floor. They stopped on the third landing, outside the door that had once belonged to Elias Thorne. It was their door now. Inside, the transformation was absolute. Sunlight streamed through massive, crystal-clear windows, illuminating a space that was open, airy, and beautiful. The walls were painted a warm cream. The floors were made of polished hardwood, and the constant, maddening drip from a leaky roof had been replaced by a profound, peaceful silence. This wasn't just an apartment, it was a sanctuary, a testament to her survival, a physical manifestation of her new, unwritten future. The sounds of her new life were a symphony of peace. In a bright, spacious kitchen filled with the aroma of roasting chicken. The only rhythmic sound was the gentle hum of a new refrigerator. Instead of counting her last few dollars, Clara was teaching Sophia how to measure flour for a cake. Leo sat at a large, solid oak dining table, not staring grimly out a window, but doing his homework, a small, genuine smile on his face as he worked. The hollow ache of hunger in Clara's stomach had been replaced by the pleasant, warm feeling of fullness, of providing. In the corner of the sun-drenched living room, her beloved antique sewing machine, its black iron body gleaming, was finally plugged into a safe, modern outlet. Its steady, whirring needle stitched its way across a bolt of vibrant blue silk, its gentle hum not a reminder of a lost livelihood, but the sound of creativity, of choice, of a future she was now free to design herself. She watched her children, her heart so full of love and relief it felt like it might burst. The ghosts of the past had been banished by the promise of 1,000 happy tomorrows. Clara's story is a testament to the enduring power of truth. It proves that even in the darkest, most forgotten corners of the world, justice can be unearthed, and a legacy of crime can be undone by a single act of courage. She descended into a tomb of despair and emerged with the key to her own redemption and the liberation of generations. Her journey from a desperate widow on the brink of homelessness to a secure and celebrated hero shows that the past is never truly dead, and it waits patiently for a voice brave enough to speak its secrets aloud. The fight for what is right is often a lonely and terrifying battle, fought in the shadows against overwhelming power. If you believe that one person's refusal to surrender can rewrite history and that fighting for a long-buried truth is a battle worth waging, then subscribe to our channel. Become part of a community that understands that every hidden room has a story, and every story deserves to be heard.